Greetings and welcome, I'm Ash, and today I would like to talk to you about Warhammer Vermintide 2, which is due to arrive next month, bringing with it an assortment of new maps, enemies, and specializations to mess around with. That last part is perhaps the most significant, since the already diverse cast of heroes is getting even more customization options. So instead of just being a quote-unquote normal dwarf, Bardin will be able to don the immensely heavy gear of the Ironbreaker, focus on ranged weaponry through the Ranger veteran career, or just grow a giant mohawk and throw himself into the thickest fighting as a Slayer. If you don't know much about the Warhammer world, those specializations might seem a bit on the generic side, but as someone that has spent the last 10 or so years fawning over both Warhammer Fantasy and 40k, I must say their inclusion fills me with a great deal of joy. After all, it is not every day that you get to play as a half-naked dwarf with a serious case of anger management issues. And speaking of playing, I recently had a chance to explore Vermintide 2's fairly brief and very early demo. Bardin and his lovely mohawk were unfortunately unavailable, but I did get to check out Marcus Kruber and his Warhammer-wielding knight loadout, as well as Carillian's Dark Elf-inspired shade specialization that came with a rather stylish ornate spear. The whole pre-alpha demo took me around 10 minutes to finish, but even that was enough to show me that Vermintide 2 is shaping up to be an extremely solid sequel. One that expands upon the original in a variety of ways, while still keeping the core gameplay at the very forefront. The one big difference between the heroes in the original and the specializations in Vermintide 2 is that each specialization gets a unique ability that complements their playstyle. For Mr. Kruber's Knight specialization, this is a charge attack that lets him displace enemies and put himself in the most optimal position to smash someone over the head with a giant, oversized hammer. Carillian's Shade specialization, as you would expect from the name alone, gives her the ability to disappear out of sight and phase through enemies. On its own, this isn't really that exciting, but since the Shade's murderous prowess passive grants her insane damage when attacking from behind, the stealth ability is a lot more devastating and a lot more proactive than it might seem at first glance. While I enjoyed playing as both heroes, I must go with Carillian as my current favorite. I'm not the kind of player that likes to ram his face straight through a horde of filthy ratmen, so the overly aggressive Knight Kruber didn't really gel with me. The Shade Carillian, on the other hand, now that I can work with. Not only does it offer a spear as a precise weapon to slice a Chaos Warrior's head clean off, but the stealth has proven to be an excellent tool for supporting my I don't like getting hit in the face lifestyle. Add a very Dark Elf themed repeater crossbow into the mix and it should be fairly easy to see why I've decided to side with Carillian on this one. That said, all of this is just a matter of playstyle because I don't think I was underpowered as either hero. My opinion might change once I get more experience and test out all of the various weapon and class combinations, but I somehow doubt it because the combat is more focused on player skill rather than the type of equipment. In other words, there's not a problem you can't solve through some well-timed strikes and a bit of good old-fashioned teamwork. In terms of mechanics, the combat in Vermintide 2 is pretty much exactly the same as it was in the original. There might be some minor improvements I missed due to not playing Vermintide in a couple of months, but at the end of the day, it is still a combination of dodging, blocking, and striking at the perfect time. I would have preferred to see at least some sort of new major move that's available to all heroes, a move such as parrying or tackling, but honestly, I can't really complain too much since the combat was and still is extremely solid. The one area the combat did significantly improve in, however, is the enemy variety. Instead of only fighting the Skaven, which rely on numbers to overcome their individual weakness, the newly added Chaos Forces are vastly more powerful, albeit smaller in number. Now, if you're a fan of cleaving through hordes of enemies, worry not as there are still large amounts of Norsemen and Skaven to contend with, But they are now also often intermingled with noticeably more powerful Chaos Marauders, and sometimes even fully fledged Chaos Warriors. As you might imagine, trying to bring down someone who has dedicated their entire life to the ruinous powers is not exactly an easy task, and this is something Vermintide 2 has managed to successfully translate in-game. The hulking Chaos Warriors are far more durable and far more savage than their northern brethren, so instead of simply poking them from range, you will need to actively dodge their flurry of attacks in order to find an opening. They aren't a mini-boss, so they aren't really as strong as something like a Red Ogre, but when combined with a horde of other enemies, they make for some satisfying and potentially even deadly battles. Besides the overly spiky Warriors of Chaos, I also had a chance to fight against two other enemies. A Plague Cultist of Nurgle and a rather disgusting Chaos Spawn. Out of the two, I have to admit, the Cultist was a much more interesting fight since the Chaos Spawn might as well be a reskinned Rat Ogre. It technically has a different moveset and it definitely has different attack patterns, but you fight it in basically the same way as a Rat Ogre, so I can't exactly say I'm impressed with what is supposed to be a new mini-boss. There were some even bigger monsters teased at the very end of the demo, however, so there is still hope you'll be able to have a proper fight with some of the most vicious creatures found throughout the Warhammer world. Thankfully, the Plague Cultist, or whatever the abomination might be called, was a much more interesting and much more frequent encounter. More importantly, it was an enemy unlike any other, which made the already hectic fights even more unpredictable. And unpredictable might just be the best way to describe these Plague Cultists, since they take a long time to recharge between each area effect spell, yet they compensate for that fact with the ability to frequently teleport around. That might sound like a bit of a hassle right now, but in my eyes they're a really good addition since they offer an interesting choice between dodging their slow spells or just hunting them down so you have one less thing to worry about. They're not the most complex of enemies, and odds are you won't be dying to them very often, but they are tricky enough to keep you on your toes, which probably is for the best since you will be meeting a whole bunch of them. What other types of enemies we'll get to see, I'm afraid I simply don't know, but as long as they follow the Plague Cultist formula, I feel they're going to be a much welcome addition to Vermintide 2. After all, the more diverse and interesting the enemies are, the more enjoyable it is to repeatedly hit them in the face with an oversized hammer, or just set them on fire, whichever you prefer. In terms of visuals, the original Vermintide was and still is no slouch. It might not have the raw fidelity of modern AAA titles, but the combination of great atmosphere and art direction made it a real treat to explore. With that in mind, I'm very glad to say that Vermintide 2 has decided to continue that tradition as well. This was especially noticeable when I was approaching the burned village that is the centerpiece of the short demo. There was an uneasy haze spreading throughout the whole city. The ground was drenched in ash, and the once tall buildings were all ravaged and left exposed to the elements. It was a very powerful moment, and I can only hope there will be more like it further on, as that will make Vermintide 2's maps quite memorable indeed. I won't critique any of the visual problems I encountered since I only had access to a very early build, but there is one major issue I do need to discuss, and that is visual clarity. When you're simply looking at the charred city, it truly is an impressive sight to behold, but trying to navigate through its darkened streets that are covered in smoke and ash is a little bit of a problem. It wasn't until my 4th playthrough that I even realized that a side route to take fairly early on, and all of it is because of a lack of any sort of visual guide. Similarly, trying to figure out where black items such as bombs are located is an incredibly difficult task since they easily blend into the background. Some might argue this is intended since these are powerful items we're talking about, but I really don't feel like this is the sort of difficulty Vermintide 2 should be striving for. As such, out of all the problems I've encountered throughout the whole demo, this is the only one I would consider big enough to potentially dampen my enjoyment of Vermintide 2. I can only hope the final version will have much better visual clarity since, as I said, this demo is practically ancient. Or at least that the items are going to be just a little bit more colorful, because running around and mashing the pickup key is not the most enjoyable of activities. After playing through the short demo multiple times now, I think I can safely say that Warhammer Vermintide 2 is a proper sequel in every sense of the term. It carries on pretty much all of the elements that made the original good, while also adding a whole bunch of new locations and items to play around with, as well as some much needed quality of life changes. As the old adage says, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The one downside to this approach is that if you weren't a fan of its predecessor, I highly doubt Vermintide 2 will be able to keep your attention either. On the positive side, if you love playing pest control in Vermintide regardless of its flaws, then I truly do believe that Vermintide 2 is going to be well worth checking out. Whatever the case may be, we'll find out soon enough as Warhammer Vermintide 2 is set to arrive this March 8th. Thank you guys for watching, and if you enjoyed this, or even if you didn't, please do let me know. And with that said, I hope you guys have a nice day, and I'll see you soon. See ya!